Ukrainian soldiers have been given these orders that they can't complain about foreign weapons. They can't complain about foreign weapons, right? At least not on social media, okay? They can complain privately. I mean, the right to complain is sacred. That's a saying that we have in Spanish, you know? El derecho a pataleta es sagrado. The right to complain, to bitch and moan, that's sacred. And everybody should have the right to complain. But the Zelensky regime doesn't want soldiers to complain publicly. Now, why would they issue such an order? See? Why? Because the weapons are so great? No, because they're garbage. That's the problem. That's why they're issuing this order, okay? And this is something that we're seeing in the West that ought to make NATO, the NATO military commanders, very, very nervous. You see, over the last 30 years or so, ever since the end of the Cold War, the Americans and all of its NATO allies, who are, of course, the consumers, the buyers of American weapons, right? Well, the problem that has happened is that all of these weapon systems are incredibly expensive. And what's funny is that, see, they take a really good weapon that really works, that gets the job done, and they replace it with something that kind of doesn't. It kind of sucks, you know, but is much more expensive. Like, for instance, you guys who are airplane buffs will know that the A-10 Groundhog, whatever it's called, you know, it's the A-10. It's this plane that's got two engines by the tail and straight stubby wings, and that seems to be made of cast iron because you can, like, you know, shoot all kinds of anti-aircraft fire at it, and the thing will keep on flying. And it's supposed to be used for close ground support of tanks, right? And so this, you know, really battle-hardened aircraft, an aircraft that, like I said, it's like made of iron and totally impenetrable. And very, very effective and very cost-effective. Well, they wanted to replace it with the F-35. You know, the F-35, the Joint Strike Fighter that's supposed to be able to do everything. And it's supposed to be able to do everything better than any kind of specialized aircraft. Because, of course, the A-10 is a very specialized aircraft. It's for close ground support. That's what it's for, you know. It's not for carrying, you know, supersonic nuclear missiles or some shit like that, okay? It's not designed to go at Mach 3.5. No, it's a slow, boring, very maneuverable, and very secure plane, durable, that's the word I was looking for, very durable plane that can withstand a hell of a lot of fire and get the job done. And it was cheap. But, of course, the Americans over the last 30 years, what's happened is that their entire armed force has been filled to the brim with extremely expensive, extremely complicated weapons that are fragile. You know, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, they've spent like $1 trillion on it. I'm not kidding. $1 trillion on its development and all the rest of it. It's insane amount of money. And the funny thing is that something like a third of it is permanently grounded. A third of it, a third of the fleet. You know, not one permanent is like, no, and let me rephrase that. See, at any given point, 1 out of 3 of those planes is not able to fly. It's not able to fly because of software issues. Software issues seems to be like the big thing. And like, you know, you got Silicon Valley, man. Call them up and get Google or Apple or somebody to fix it. But no, you know, the software seems to be a big problem. But ultimately, the big problem is that, see, it's an aircraft that's trying to do everything. And so, of course, it does nothing particularly well. That's what's going on with that particular aircraft. And it's exceptionally expensive. It's so expensive that people feel nervous about flying it. Because what if it gets shot at? And so the point, because, you know, if you're afraid of your gear getting blown up, then why do you have it? I mean, in the military, that's the whole point of gear. It's going to get blown up. But that's what's going on with a lot of the Western gear. It's too fragile. It's too complicated. It's exceptionally expensive, and somebody making a hell of a lot of money on this gear, but it doesn't work. The Ukrainian soldiers complain, they bitch and moan about Polish tanks. Apparently they're garbage. About the M113 armored personnel carrier, they also think it's garbage, and also they think it's a death trap. They're like a rolling coffin. They're terrified of getting into it. They don't. Okay. They're also complaining about javelins and stingers because they're saying they're too complicated and they don't get the job done. And this is actually true because a lot of military observers have noted that there are Russian tanks that clearly have had like 3, 4 direct hits from these javelin anti-tank missiles, and the tanks are still running after 3, 4 direct hits. So what's the point of the javelin? I mean, the whole point of a missile like the javelin is that you shoot it once, done. The thing is dead. The tank is dead with just the one shot. But I saw one video that was taken like a first person guy, you know, some guy holding a camera while the other guy used a javelin from like the second or third story window of some building. And there was a tank rolling by, a Russian tank rolling by. It was clear because of the Z. And the tank was rolling by, and these guys shot a javelin right at it. I'm talking, man, it couldn't have been more than maybe 15 meters, 20 meters tops, right at it. And the tanks are like stopped, swiveled around. I mean, it was so funny. It was anthropomorphic, you know. The tank looked like a person or looked like a giant, you know, mechanized animal of some sort. It got hit, it stopped, it sort of like swiveled its turret, like what was that? And then it kept on going. It was so funny, man. It was so funny. It was just so ridiculous. And how expensive are these javelin missiles? You know how expensive they are? They're something like $50,000 a pop, man. And they're not getting the job done. This order by the propaganda arm of the Zelensky regime telling soldiers not to bitch and moan about the armies, about the weapons rather, the Western weapons. You see, these Western weapons, it's pointless, okay? And quite apart from the fact that they don't work. The point is that, see, to get these weapons to where they are needed in Ukraine, well, they have to cross the Polish-Ukrainian border on the west. Ukraine is a huge country. I've said so many times because I've crossed it. I've crossed it on my motorcycle. It took me 4 days on squeaky clean highways, you know, with no javelin fire, no artillery fire on my position as I crossed the country on my motorcycle. Right? It took me 4 days. So imagine you bring in weapons from Poland into Ukraine, and they've already blown out the train, so you have to ship it by truck. Okay? I mean, the opportunities to hit it by the Russians are innumerable. And eventually you have to get it to the soldiers at the front, and the front is on the east, in the Donbass region. And the problem also is that, see, number one, these weapons, you have to train on them. It's not simply that you just pick it up and start using it. It's not like a rifle or a handgun. Any kind of sophisticated weapon takes a long time to train on it. It's not easy, okay? And you can't be an idiot. You have to actually have some brains and pay attention, and you have to practice with it a while before you're going to be effective with that weapon, whatsoever that weapon may be. The only weapon you don't have to train with is actually an assault rifle or a handgun or a knife. Everything else, you have to train because these weapons are complex. Even if they don't seem so, they are. And the Ukrainian armed forces don't have the time to train. And another problem that's severe is that, see, the Ukrainian armed force does not have men in the rear to repair this gear that they are getting from the West. You see, you're in the front, you're driving a tank, say, right? And the tank breaks down. Well, you got in the back, you know, a whole boatload of guys whose job in the army is to fix your tank. And you're the tank driver, and that's your job, to drive the tank. And there's a turret officer, right, or whatever he's called, and he's like the guy in charge of shooting the tank, right? Shooting from the tank, rather. But, you know, there are mechanics way back, and so if your tank, you know, breaks down, the mechanic shows up and fixes it. That's his job. And if there isn't such a man, then if your tank breaks down, it's useless. And you have to abandon it. And of course you have to abandon it as quickly as possible, because if your tank breaks down wherever you are, and it's not moving, it becomes a target. And if you're in it, you're going to be dead. So you have to abandon the tank as quickly as possible if it breaks down, because sooner or later, somebody's going to show up with like whatever and blow it up. Unless it's repaired. But if you don't have the guys to repair it, then it's just a hunk of junk. You see? And so all of these weapons, and this is a long-winded video to basically say the following. See, all of these weapons that the West is promising Ukraine, all of these weapons that the Zelensky regime is telling its soldiers not to complain about, see, they're kind of pointless. Because you see, the Ukrainian soldiers who would need them, number one, they're not trained on them. And they're not going to have the time to train on them properly to be able to use them effectively, number one. And number two, they don't have the men to repair these weapons. And that's the key issue, because stuff in a war breaks. The NATO forces, the American forces, they have fallen into this habit of having very delicate gear that breaks down and that requires a lot of support, a lot of maintenance. And of course, this makes a lot of sense when you understand the whole procurement process insofar as weapons for the United States and NATO. Because the weapons manufacturers, they make a lot of money from the maintenance part. They make a lot of money from selling training courses and whatnot to the Department of Defense to train people to repair this very expensive, very delicate gear. And in a weird way, they want gear that's fairly delicate, because that way they sell more spare parts. They make more money. And so that's a problem that all of a sudden the United States Armed Forces, NATO Armed Forces, are realizing that all the gear they've got is fragile. I think it's part of the reason, not the sole reason, but part of the reason that NATO has not gotten into this war and has no intention of getting into it, because they know how fragile their gear actually is, how shitty and expensive all their weapons really are.